So, welcome everyone. Thank you, Mark, and I really appreciate you actually putting into writing your take on SFBT 2.0 version, because having come to SF in, 2011, I'm not conscious of all the background and all the changes that have occurred along the way. So for me, it actually gave a really concise history of how things have changed. So I appreciate you putting that into one document so I don't have to go searching for that. That's wonderful. So I think everyone else has appreciated that as well.
So I'm Mark McKergow. I'm in Edinburgh in Scotland now. I'm thoroughly enjoying it here. And the main work I'm doing these days is writing and teaching about solution focus and host leadership and the broader conception of managing in a complex and continuously changing world. Annette, you go. Great. And then we'll see you next.
Sure. So I'm Annette Gray. The main work I do is running training programs for developing leaders in coaching skills, doing one-to-one coaching, as well as being a senior leader in growth coaching as well.
Okay. So hi folks, I'm going to switch to slides for this. We can see some people in the video camera still. I'm going to talk for a bit, then we'll have a pause for some questions. I'm going to talk for a bit more, and then we'll have another pause for probably slightly longer questions and discussion. So do note your questions as we go along. First of all, it's great to see so many people, so many old friends and some new friends as well, and looking forward to this session today. So those of you who've seen me speak before will know that I always almost start with this slide, which is I've described as my best one-line definition of solution focus. Change is happening all the time. It's a working hypothesis. Therefore, the simple way to change is to find useful change and amplify it. And I'm going to start by saying I modified this slide for the first time in about 20 years recently. And I've modified it to this. Change is happening all the time. The simple way to change is to notice useful change. You see, I can't even say it yet. The simple way to change is to find useful change and amplify it. So find useful change to notice useful change. And there's something slightly different in quality about finding and noticing that I think is an important piece of this SF 2.0 that I am kind of trying to give voice to in this paper. So the outline for today is quick look at the development of solution-focused work over at least 3 phases. Look at SF 1.0, which hardly anyone does anymore in a really, really strict way, although there are people who do. And look at SF 2.0 that's, I think, appearing all over the place now, and give reasons why I think it needs identifying as something slightly different, but still connected with the original SF thing, and some possible implications for our choices in SF work. And I doubt we'll get to the final thing about how does it work, given that we've only got a short session today. So why am I doing this? Let me just say this. I am not proposing anything new here. What I am seeking to do is give voice and shape to what I am observing in my own practice and in the world of SF practice that is developing. So this is not, if you like, a blueprint. This is a statement of how things seem to be right now to me, which is why the paper was called, the original paper published in the Journal of Solution Focused Brief Therapy was called how the next generation has already arrived. So I'm doing it because of changes in my own perceptions of how SF works and can work. From when I started in 1993, and even up to when I wrote with Paul Jackson the Solutions Focused book, the first version, this shift in my perception of how SF works from an aha and kaboom sort of model, where there's a aha moment where suddenly things get unlocked, to a conversation that gradually builds, and at the end of the conversation you know you're in a different place as the customer than you were at the start, but you can't quite put your finger on when did that happen. And I've found over many years now, I've been doing solution-focused conversations in training, and making up the numbers by sitting opposite somebody who's reading from a script almost, doing, let's say, a future perfect exercise. And they kind of do this. I do a 10-minute conversation, and at the end of the conversation, I'm in a different place than I was at the beginning. They've just been reading the questions to me. And I can't quite say there wasn't one question that was, that's it, that opens up new things. But I'm definitely in a different place with different options at the end of that conversation than I was at the beginning. So I think that, as we'll see, this idea of a sort of how does this work is impacting why I'm doing this. Secondly, I'm pulling together, I think, many developments that have been seen over the past 15 years, not just from Brief in London. Brief have, of course, been leading the way in many ways, and a lot of this work kind of develops along with them and by them. But there are other people as well who are kind of well in the lead, Elliot Connie, for example, and many others, who are kind of moving this way. And some have moved faster than others, and some have moved further than others. But I think it's worth stating the case that this is a slightly different thing we're doing now than the people did right at the beginning. And thirdly, I think this offers an even clearer and more researchable way to explore SF once it's named and defined. But we have to kind of name it and define it first before we can start to research it and not confuse it with the other thing. So, quick slide. This is a very busy slide here. This is the development of SFBT and solution-focused practice, therefore, in general, because all the rest of solution-focused work comes from roots in solution-focused brief therapy. This is a slide I made some time ago, and this shows, I'm not going to go through it all, but the development from the MRI model brief therapy of the 1960s and 70s to the brief family therapy of the early 1980s, started off with ecosystemic therapy, and to the early SFBT of the late 1980s. And just wondering if whoever's
I think it's David.
Reorganizing their
David, if you could go on mute, is that possible?
The mic started working now, David. Thanks.
Yeah.
So
thanks.
the early SFBT of the late 1980s. So which is written up in Steve DeShaze's book Clues, which for many people is the first real solution-focused brief therapy book, and lots of people, Brief and me included, kind of learnt our solution focus with the client in one hand and the book in the other. And it's worth looking at that. There's a flow chart in that book that says what you do. First of all, you see what sort of relationship the person in front of you is in, customer, complainant, visitor. You construct a complaint, which is a solvable problem. You look for exceptions to that complaint, times when the problem should have happened but didn't. And if you find them, then you can do more of what works straight away. And if you can't find them, then you look for hypothetical solutions, and that starts to mean something like a miracle question. And then there are small goals. You give small steps, and you set experiments for the customer. And notice that in this version, the kind of future perfect miracle question is right at the end of the process, and if you can't find anything else that works, do this, which is very different to even where SF 1.0 is. So then, of course, solution-focused practice emerged through the 90s and the noughties, and some people stuck pretty close to that original conception, particularly in the United States, I think. And this, what I've called SF 1.0, is taken from what's called the SFBT treatment manual. This was published by Cynthia Franklin and her colleagues in their 2011 book from Oxford University Press about solution focus. And this is what they say solution focus is in 2011, and as far as I know, they still say this. So here it is, pre-session change. You ask about pre-session change. You set goals, preferably small goals. You ask a miracle question and do all the unpacking around that. You ask scaling questions. You construct exceptions to the problem. You ask coping questions if appropriate and necessary. You have a break. You have compliments about strengths and resources. And then there's homework, which is either designed by the client or an experiment suggested by the therapist or the practitioner. Now, that's down in current books as a version, an authoritative version of what SF should be. And I think that all builds on, that all sort of comes out of those roots in from family therapy and the MRI model brief therapy, which is about breaking patterns. So, but here are some of the developments that I've seen that I think start to move us on from that. And but those of you who learned SF from me, and that's quite a few people on this call, first of all, you can kind of mostly relax because I've been doing quite a lot of this all the way along. And so some of this won't come as a surprise to you. But if we've got anyone who's a real devotee of the old school, then it might. So this is a list of emerging developments. Now I'm going to unpack the first one, and then we're going to have a break for conversation. So here are the developments I see. Firstly, the move from action language to description language. From language of what can you or did you do to language of what did you notice or could you notice. And that, I think, is the most significant development. This next one is away from questions along to, it says there, rooms and tools. This is chunks of conversation. So stop focusing on questions, solution-focused questions, onto how to build a chunk of solution-focused conversation around the thing. And anyone who's read my book, The Solutions Focus, will be very familiar with this idea of tools. Thirdly, from goals, which are still contained in the SF1 classic description, to this idea of best hopes or common project or platform, as I would call it, which is much less than a goal. It's a topic for a conversation. When we come to doing things like preferred futures and scales, we use the same questions, but we have slightly different aims for those questions because of our move to description language. And I'll come to talk about that later. We're moving away from exceptions to the problem to instances of the solution, or counters, as I would call it. Clearer focus on discussions about the past and present, which connect with the better future that we're working towards. So it's not just any old exception to the problem. We want a more precise thing, which is an example or something that connects with the better future. And say my counters tool already does this. We're going to be losing a lot of hangovers from family therapy. When Steve DeShazer and Inso Kim Berg and co developed solution-focused therapy, they were doing it in the context of a school emerging from family therapy. So that's things like, we don't have a team behind a mirror usually anymore. We don't then have a break to discuss things with the team behind a mirror because there isn't a team. The team are not going to devise a task or an intervention anymore. We're going to be much more interested in asking the client, or even just leaving it be. So there are various, by losing those hangovers from family therapy, we can simplify the process quite a lot further. And finally, ending the session, some would say, and my chums at Brief would say this, we don't need to give a task or even talk about actions because the work has already been done in the session and people will do the things they're going to do. They would say we need to do more appreciative summarizing at the end of the session to draw things together. And I'll talk about, I think that's basically right, although in organizational settings, I think there are still good reasons to talk about actions. So these are some of the developments that I've talked about, seen, that I think point the way to SF 2.0. Now, before we go any further, let me just say that this is not an either or thing. It's not you do SF1 or you do SF2. There are loads and loads of in-between possibilities. And it's rare these days that I come across somebody who's talking about doing SF1 straight. I had a conversation with Peter de Jong, and he reckoned that by the end of her life, Insoo Kim Berg was doing about SF 1.6. But Steve and Insoo didn't write all that much in the last 10 years of their lives. So their practice did emerge, but they didn't particularly communicate that terribly well in writing outside of their demonstrations. So you may well be that many of you on this call are well on this journey towards SF2 already, and it's not a kind of binary thing. There are all sorts of shades of grey around this. So let me do the first one, and then we'll have a pause. This idea of action language and description language. So action language appears in both MRI model brief therapy and in classic solution focused practice. Specific, concrete, descriptive information. And this is one of the things in the interactional brief therapy model, the tradition that's been really important over the decades. Who does what, to whom, with whom, when, and in what order. And that's a quote from an old MRI paper. And this is the difference between talking with your client about specific, concrete, descriptive information, as opposed to trying to find explanations for the problem happening by delving into the past. So this is getting away from a sort of abstract causal language to specific, concrete, descriptive language. And that's always been part of all the brief therapy models from the MRI tradition onwards. And in MRI model, it's therapy, it's to gather information about the pattern that holds the problem in place so we can break that pattern. But in classic solution-focused practice, it's to gather information about exceptions to the problem. We have concrete descriptive information about the problem thing. Now we know what we're looking for when we're trying to find something else. But in both cases, the practitioner is asking questions about this specific concrete descriptive information to construct interventions to disrupt the problem pattern or promote the solution pattern and promote new possible behavior. So the practitioner is asking the questions in order to use the answers to construct what the client ought to do next. But if we move on to description language, this is specific, concrete, descriptive information. Again, it's the same thing, but it's now who notices what, about whom, with whom, when, and in what order. So rather than who does what, who notices what. And this, of course, can be in the future as well as the past very easily. Difficult to talk about what we will do in the future, but it's very easy to talk about who would notice, who might notice what in the future. And so this is about preferred futures and future perfects as well as instances in the past. And not in terms of doing, but in terms of noticing. And here's the key point. Why are we asking these questions? Not to construct interventions and tasks. Making these descriptions is the intervention, is the thing that we do that helps people reorient themselves in their lives and their interactions and their worlds. So we're not asking these questions so we can gather the information and use it cleverly back with the client. We're asking these questions so the client answers them and stretches their world, as I would say it, by envisaging, imagining, noticing things in the future, the present, and the past that they might have perhaps not seen as important before. And this is the intervention, and so we don't then need to construct an intervention. And this is the key thing, I think. It's the change in the focus of the practitioner from gathering information to be used to construct end-of-session messages and interventions, to being a co-builder of rich and detailed descriptions. And here are 5 ways that we do that, and so some of you will be very familiar with these, but these are not in SF1 in many ways. Prompting for detail, What would be the first tiny signs that something was happening? Prompting for interactions. What would person X notice that would tell them you were doing Y? Prompting for consequences. What difference would that make to you? What difference would that make to someone else? Prompting for the next elements. What else? The classic what else question, for example. And prompting the client to continue. And we do that in all sorts of non-verbal ways, like nodding, smiling, grunting, aha-ing, leaning forward, writing things down, looking interested, and so forth. And as the client does this, the client is changing themselves. That's my hypothesis, without help, by stretching their world, by this idea of exploring their world in a different way. And that's the intervention of solution focus 2, not whatever thing, the clever thing the client, the practitioner might come up with at the end of the session. So in a way, we're doing a lot of the same things, but there's a slightly different idea here about why are we doing it. We're not doing it so we can use information. We're doing it to encourage the client to explore these things, and that is what we do. So I'm going to do a little pause for discussion. I'll leave this one up. I should just say that it's rather striking. Peter de Jong and I had a conversation about this a few months ago. And of course, Peter worked with the microanalysis people and worked with INSU for many, many, many years. And we compared an INSU session that he nominated as an SF1 with a Chris Iveson session that I nominated as SF2. And in that session, Chris asked what difference would that make, or some version of it, 26 times. And anyone who's watched Iveson in action will know that, you know, it's like a ferret up a drain pipe. You know, what difference would that make to you? He just kind of goes there all the time. INSU didn't ask it once. And it was really, really interesting to see the difference between kind of INSU getting an answer to a numerical question or an accept question, and then kind of accepting it and moving on, where compared with the kind of expanding on that people are doing, more and more people are doing now. And I think this is really where the rubber hits the road, this expanding of the details that we can do with our clients right there in the room. So let's have a little pause for questions, thoughts so far, and so forth, before I go on to talk about all the other elements of this idea.
Can I just dive in?
Yeah, please dive in, because it's hard to see people with the...
Okay, so
you can raise your hand, just to say, I think you can raise your hand in Zoom, and that's one way of managing this.
If you click on participants on the bottom of the page, up comes a list of all the participants, and you'll see their raised hand. So I just raised my hand, and that I think sends a message to...
It does.
Annette to say, can you bring us in, please?
Yeah, so that's one way of managing this process. So Shakya has his hand up already, so let's start with him, and anyone else who wants to offer a thought, then please raise your hand there, and it's in the participants tab at the bottom of the screen. So Shakya, go for it.
Okay, I just wanted to make a comment, and I wanted to dive in first because I was right at the beginning of what you said. So I'm just observing that what you seem to be doing with this paper and this presentation is observing useful change and amplifying it.
Well, it remains to be seen whether it's useful, I would say. Okay. I think it's useful, but you know, there's a lot of research out there, but it's not clear whether it's in SF1 or not. A lot of it is. But I think that there are sort of useful distinctions here. So we make the distinctions, and then we can investigate them and try them out and explore them and to be more conscious about what we're doing.
Great. And a question. So you've been presenting this as SFBT, and from the sphere of organizational work and coaching in particular. You've made one little observation about the possibility of keeping actions in a corporate context just because that's expected. I just wondered if you had any more to say about the contrast between therapy and organizational work.
No, I think that's the only one. I think that this is very, very doable in organisation. It's much more doable in a way than SF1 was, because it's very clearly a kind of emergent process around building details, and that's something that we can do very easily in organisations, and it is something that I observe organisations respond well to, given a run at it.
Thank you.
So, Svea and John have their hands up. Svea, do you want to go? Do you want to go next?
Hi, I think John was before me.
Okay.
It doesn't
John,
matter.
gallantly go first, please.
Okay, so I'm going to do a Chris Iveson and dive into the detail a bit, Mark, because I'm interested. In my work with teams, they often say to me, we want you to summarize the conversation. And what I do now is actually say to them, no, I want you to summarize the conversation. And you repeat back to me what you think has been said. And I find that works a lot better now. And I'm just, would you agree in your work practice with organizations? How do you do that?
Yes, and I think that me summarising it in a way is me doing the work when they need to do the work. It's a bit like asking your physiotherapist to go and run around the block for you or something. But what when we talk about appreciative summarising, I mentioned the idea of appreciative summarising. This is a sort of alternative to compliments in the kind of conventional sense. And the reason, I'll talk about this later on, but the reason that the sort of compliments part of the solution-focused classic model is where it is because that's the way that you get the client into a good mood to accept the task that you're going to give them. And if you're not going to give them a task, then you perhaps don't need to do that same kind of sustained barrage of compliments. Maybe there are other ways to do it, and summarising appreciatively as we go along. And this is a way of bringing in some appreciation, which I think is important, but not doing it as a sort of, in this kind of classic, here's a load of compliments at the end of the session. But I'd certainly, anything, getting the people doing the work is crucial.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Svea, hello.
Okay, hi. Well, first of all, thank you. Lots and lots of things are bubbling, but I chose one or two. What I noticed, and I'm very glad to hear, is the comment about, I'm not sure what you said verbatim, but that often how people practice and how they think about this practice depends on whom or how they encountered and explored solution-focused originally. Because I find, and I do think that that's a very useful question to ask one another, is when and where and how did you first encounter this work? Because that often cuts through a lot of arguments and positioning and other stuff. And I probably say that because when I was listening, Mark, I thought I learned originally by reading work, mostly Steve Deshaies', not by seeing, by reading and doing. And much of what you call the 2.0 for me sounds so familiar to what I remember from 1989. So I'm now challenged to go back and look at transcripts and think about this more and think, so thank you for this. But I think that comment about let's be, as a community, let's find out more from one another about when, where, and how did you first encounter and explore this? Because in that may well be much more conversation to be had rather than people getting into these different camps and positions. So that's a comment from me. And the other thing that I wanted to just is more question is, as I'm listening, I get the experience of listening to a description through the lens of the practitioner. rather than the interactive kind of lens, which is what are clients and practitioners each contributing, and how does that create some, or co-create something, and what is the something that they co-create? So that's my question is, I mean, do you have an intention to write a further version which looks at the interconnectedness of how we aren't so much noticing, but we are inviting the client to comment on what they have said about what they're noticing and what we're noticing, and in a way it's much more complicated, or complex, not complicated, more complex than us noticing or us finding. It's got not so much to do with just what we are doing.
No, that's of course that's right. It's about getting the client to notice. You know, having the client doing this noticing is surely the most important piece of it. But our role is to, if you like, encourage and join in with that process and help keep it in focus and and relevant. So this is where this sort of shift in mindset for me becomes so important. This idea of, are we listening to build an intervention, or are we listening simply to encourage the client down the road of detail, interactions, consequences, and so forth that is there? Because I think that takes sort of, and allows us, if we're not doing the former, it allows us to do the latter even better. For me, sort of, because I know that I'm not going to be required to kind of, I don't have to make sense of it in a big picture. I just have to encourage the client to kind of go down these roads, because I'm not going to be required to use the information. They are saying it so they can use the information. Now, I suspect this was always, a lot of this was always there in a way. What you said to start with, you know, none of this, if you like, is not there in the kind of early versions of SF, but there's a lot of other things that are there in those versions that I think are sort of falling away now. And I think that gives us a good opportunity to kind of rethink a little bit about how this happens. And when I started, you know, back in the sort of early mid-90s, the idea, you know, there were still teams, and there were still one-way mirrors in some places, and this was, you know, when we did training sessions with Steve, you know, he would speak with the client and then come back to us, and we'd have the conversation about what the intervention should be. So I kind of, you know, that's where I started from it, which is maybe why I'm thinking that this is you know, this is an important sort of shift that's been happening. So I say I'm not proposing this as a new model. I'm saying this is what I observe, and I think it's important.
Okay, lots of food for thought. Thank you. And I think a lot of this for me is about, do people focus on the practices or the principles, or the principles and practices? So I'm going to go away and think about all of this. Thank you.
Deborah.
I think what I want to say, really, you've probably reinforced it, but it's making me think about a webinar that I might mention. But through my coaching work, I've found this, what I learned through you, when I managed to incorporate that, and so it sort of became very authentic into my way of doing things, I found it extremely powerful for working with people. So I can work with them in a very collaborative way. So I'm collaborating to assist them in their own learning and discovery, and in finding their own solutions. Because what's one of the things that stuck with me from the work that I learned with you was they're the expert of their world. So I need to be an expert at asking questions or helping people find what they need to learn and notice what might actually work for them. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that's I think what our role is to do that.
Yes.
Right.
So the webinar I watched a couple of days ago, and it very much focused on, as coaches, us needing to be more collaborative, needing to help our people in the workplace learn to be better learners. So I see this as the approach of noticing, and then leading the person, I guess, to their discovery, asking the questions around noticing actually is part of helping them learn.
Yeah, sure. And it's very surprising, you know, this thing about what would you notice. It sounds so tenuous. It sounds, and yet, once you start to get into it, it's immensely powerful. So it's a sort of it's a wolf in sheep's clothing or something. That's a bad metaphor, but it's much more powerful than it sounds at the beginning. Notice, what would you notice? Sounds just really, you know, very non-committal. But actually, as soon as you get into it, you find interesting things begin to happen, in my experience. Thanks, Deborah. And Anne, one more here.
Well, I was just going to mention that all this conversation, it was interesting. I actually had a similar conversation earlier today when I was having a debrief about an emotional intelligence 360 that I'd had. And we were talking about this noticing, and that if you can just help people do more noticing, then perhaps, you know, so as Deborah was just saying, we're helping them to raise the awareness, and then it becomes less necessary to pin down an action before we leave that session, because if we've heightened their awareness, the actions sort of emerge even between the sessions.
Yeah.
We may not even hear about it until the next time we connect.
Yeah, for sure. That's absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And actually, that's always been part of this. Is why we ask typically what's better in a follow-up session rather than the actions we talked about, precisely because of that sort of phenomenon that you just described. Other things happen that may be much more helpful. Thank you, Anne. That's great. Okay, well, look, folks, I'd like to go on and run through these other elements of that I've noticed myself in these moving from SF1 to SF2. And once again, just to reiterate that I'm not proposing this, I'm saying I've already seen this. And also, I don't yet know whether SF2 is better than SF1 or not. I think it's simpler. And I think it's more elegant, and I think it offers an answer to the question, how does this work? But I think, you know, in a way, we have to then go away and research and practice and try for ourselves on these things. So the next element of distinction was this moving away from questions to rooms and tools and chunks of conversation. And I had interesting... when you watch the videos of Steve and Insu that were produced by BFTC, the marvelous videos that they produced, often they flagged up when they ask a kind of key question, like miracle question or scaling question. There's a kind of subtitle appears in the bottom screen, scaling question, as pointing to the question. And of course, we all know, but it's worth stating it even more loudly, that the question is, you know, the scaling question or the miracle question is not of itself terribly important as much as the thing it leads to, which is the piece of conversation that then emerges from that. And this kind of model takes us to something like, or one version of it is this solution-focused art gallery metaphor, which I very much like. I got it from Chris Iveson, but also Adam Freuer and others are using this kind of idea. This is the idea that we walk into an art gallery with our client, and the first thing we come to is the ticket office, which is where we do our conversation about the best hopes or the common project that we're going to work on or the platform. And we don't get to go further until we've got some sort of common project or best hopes or platform. And then we've got our ticket, and then we can move into the rest of the art gallery, where there are several different places, and we don't have to go through this in strict order, but there's a preferred future gallery where there are images from, for example, the day after the miracle. And these images might be sort of, think of scenes, bits of the day in the life after the miracle, which are sort of scattered around the walls there. And they can be looked at, not necessarily in chronological order. There's an instances gallery, which is images from the past and the present that connect with that better future. And you can go to the instances gallery first, or you can go to the preferred future gallery first, and there's no kind of right order about this. And then as you start to leave the gallery, you go through what Chris would call the gift shop. which is summaries, images of n+1, what n+1 would look like. You know, a little thing to take away to remind yourself of your visit round the gallery from the gift shop. And I really like the way that this invites us to kind of move around these different areas of the conversation in whatever way seems to be appropriate. And this is looking at the thing in much more in terms of big chunks of conversation rather than questions. And of course, anyone who kind of trained with me over the years will be familiar with this model of 6 solutions tools that Paul Jackson and I put together as long ago as 2002, which has the same intention, to draw attention to big chunks of conversation that we have. And the arrows in this diagram were put in at the publisher's insistence, who said that people would be scared about not having a right order. So we had to put the arrows in the book. But I think these can be these tools can be used in any order, and it says there's no right order. Every case is different. So rather than focusing too much on the questions, let's focus on sustaining the conversation that evolves and emerges from the questions. Another thing is this move from goals to best hopes and common project. Working in organizations particularly have very specific ideas about what they mean by goals. And goals are usually specific and very, very often time-bound. It's do this by that time, by that date. I observe that the goals, when they're talked about by brief therapists and others, are somewhat less specific than that sometimes. But there are, I think, we're moving away from the idea of having a goal for the therapy or for the coaching to having a topic for the coaching. And there are various ways to do this. Brief have been doing their thing about what are your best hopes from this as a way of starting for a long time. The idea of the platform that Michael Hirt originated and Paul Jackson and I have built and developed. What do you want to be better? Are you prepared to act now? Check that you really have a customer for change before carrying on and getting the ticket in the ticket office. And Harry Corman has written more recently about this idea of the common project, the project that we're going to work on together, you and me, the coach and the customer. And all of these are versions of this, having a topic to start with, defining a topic, but no more than that to begin the work. And anyone who's learned with me will have the platform is one way of doing that. This idea of preferred futures and scales, of course, these are key parts of all of this practice. But perhaps if we're thinking with an SF2 hat on, we are using these questions with slightly different aims as practitioners. As I mentioned, we're moving away from gathering information to design interventions towards helping people build rich and detailed descriptions. And so the practitioner, as I said, has a different head on when you're asking these questions. You're sort of nudging customer forward into more detail and more interaction. And we're trying to get away from the idea of aha moments to a much more gradual process where we keep on asking what difference would that make and who else would notice and what would they notice and what difference would that make to them, and then what would be the first tiny signs that they would notice, that you were noticing, that they noticed, that you might have started to notice, and so on. And this is a much more gradual process, but it puts people definitely into a different place at the end of the conversation. And once again, connected with that, away from the idea of exceptions, times when the problem didn't happen, which I think I've always thought still keeps the problem in the room, because in order to have an exception, we have to know what the problem was, towards instances of times when what we want to happen did happen even a bit, which is a much clearer connection to a better future, which is definitely not there in the early forms of SF practice in the late 80s. It's definitely about exceptions to a problem. And again, those of you who've learned with me will know that the counters concept that Paul and I wrote about is very much more than just exceptions, although it's the idea of instances of the better future, but also things like cooperation, resources, skills, good qualities, all those complementable things are also part of our conception of counters. And then losing these hangovers from family therapy, which were taken as a given, I think, way back at the beginning, because the people who invented this were coming out of a family therapy tradition. So here are those hangovers that we can lose. No team, so you don't need a team behind a one-way mirror. You do, the number of places that actually do that outside of university departments, I think, is very small these days. So you don't need a team. You don't need a break, therefore, to consult with the team. And because you're not going to design a task, you don't need a break to do that either. You might have fewer compliments at the end of the session, which were originally placed there designed to get the client to accept the task that they were going to be given by the practitioner, although you don't want to lose the general appreciative attitude that we have. And so there are different ways to introduce this idea of being impressed and so forth as we go through. And perhaps most importantly, no task designed by the practitioner. You might ask people for, what are you thinking of doing next? Although my chums at Brief would not even do that. Or you might have this conversation about what would be the first tiny signs you'd got to n+1 on the scale. And the more detail you go to in these kind of conversations, the more those details are almost immediately actionable. It's really interesting. You're talking about noticing, but actually the client ends up talking to themselves about actions, because these tiny details are so small that they could, many of them, or some of them anyway, could simply be done or brought about in various ways. And so the whole conversation becomes, in a strange way, about action, even though you're not using the words action at all. And I had quite a little exchange with Harry Corman about this, and he didn't accept easily that we were moving away from action. And I said, well, we're moving away from talking about action, but of course we want action. That's what we're being paid for. So this is not about lacking desire for the client to be doing things. It's about how we move them to that point most effectively and efficiently. And then, so finally, ending the session, more appreciative summary. A good summary can be very appreciative. And I think I think it's good that a good summary also shows that we've been listening. And I don't want to come back to John's point. This is not to say that you shouldn't get the people to summarize it themselves. But again, it's a good way of being appreciative and to offer a summary. Small details from the conversation offer instant possibilities for action, as I said. And then you can talk about the client's confidence, using scales perhaps, of making progress, of maintaining the change already made, of reaching good enough. These are 3 ways Evan George has written about scaling client's confidence. I think they're all good. And finally, offer the client choice about whether and how to go on. And this is about leveling up the power relationship. Maybe not completely level, it's never completely level, but it's about being quite clear that every session might be the last. We shouldn't be assuming that people want to carry on. We should be offering them choice about how to go on when they want what they want to do next, because that's part of what we do. Is this sort of supportive collegiate position that's always an attractive part of solution focus for me. So quick summary. SFBT 1 and 2, these are things that stay the same, I think, along this spectrum. Focus on what the client wants, yes. Radical acceptance of what the client says, yes. Real questions and scales, yes. Specific, concrete details and observable descriptions, yes. Coping questions, if appropriate or necessary, yes. Following up with what's better type questions, yes. This is all, I think, the same. Here are some of the things that to me look different. away from focus on questions to a focus on chunks of conversation, away from questions to produce information for tasks, from questions to develop the client's descriptions, away from problem-free talk and straight into best hopes and platform and things like that, away from goals and again into differences that these hopes will make, away from exceptions to the problem towards instances of things connected to the best hopes and preferred future, away from compliments at the end of the session to appreciative summarizing through the session, and away from the break and end of session message to offering the chance of continuing as the person wants.
Thank you, Mark. I just love how you can conceptualize and simplify things in this way. So I've learnt a lot from tonight. So thanks everyone for joining us. And stay tuned to the next Asia Pacific Zoom session in a few months' time.
Thanks very much, everyone. Great to be
Right.
with you.
Thanks, Mark.
everyone.
Thanks, Annette.
See you. Bye.
Thank you, Annette. Bye.
Welcome. Bye.
Thank you, Annette.
You're welcome.